I'm David O'Connor. I'm the permanent observer of IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, to the United Nations. Maybe I should just quickly, for those of you who don't know, tell you what IUCN is. Thank you. IUCN is an international organization. It's both intergovernmental and non-governmental. We have both governments and NGOs as our members, thousands of members, and many thousands of scientists who work for different commissions of IUCN on species survival, on habitat, ecosystems, on education and communication, and so on. You heard the ambassador earlier this morning refer to this super year of biodiversity, and in that context he mentioned IUCN's World Conservation Congress, which will happen this year in June in Marseille, France. And this is a 4-yearly congress where the leading scientists and conservationists, practitioners from all over the world convene and learn from each other, share experiences, compare notes, and basically get inspired to continue their work. One thing you probably have heard about IUCN, if you haven't heard about the name, is something called the Red List of Threatened Species. And this is the list maintained by IUCN of those species in the world who are at various levels of threat from human activity mostly, from other stressors or sources of stress, threats of extinction. So that is now integrated into the UN's monitoring framework for the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to look at progress on some of those goals, in particular goals 14 and 15 on life underwater and life on land. Let me then just say one other thing before introducing Dale, and he can introduce himself more than I can, of course. But today I heard a lot about interactions between human and wildlife, about the need to take the big picture, look at the interlinkages between poverty and poverty eradication on the one hand, and protection of wildlife, and being able to convince people living in proximity to wildlife that it's in their interest to conserve wildlife rather than to combat wildlife, and being able to provide alternatives, means of livelihood, or means of livelihood associated with wildlife's thriving in that environment is, of course, central. And we've heard some talk about some of the ways that these conflicts can be mitigated, if not completely avoided. And I think we'll probably come back to that in a moment. But the important point is that sustainable development is the confluence of the economic aspirations of our societies for a better life, but the absolute dependence of all of us on healthy ecosystems and on the natural world to sustain our well-being now and into the future. And so the fact that this has become the central defining agenda of the United Nations, and I should just as an aside say one thing, I think Ade reminded me that I should say this, but I was actually at the center of the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I led the team in the United Nations which supported those negotiations. I worked very, very closely with the previous ambassador of Kenya, Macharia Kamau, and the ambassador of Hungary throughout those negotiations. And so I'm very proud, to say that I am one of the fathers, if you will, the parents of that set of goals and that agenda, which has really, I think, inspired everyone to look at the world differently and to look at, not just human progress on its own terms, but look at it in its relationship with nature, look at the social agenda in relation to nature and to economic progress as well. And so on that note, I'll pass it over to Dale. And Dale is a professor of philosophy and environmental studies at New York University. And looking at his bio, I see he's also had a an outstanding career teaching in other universities, including the University of Colorado at Boulder, and has written many, many interesting papers and books on environmental ethics, on a whole range, on animal welfare, and a whole range of other topics. So I'll pass it to Dale, and he can take it over.
Okay, thank you, David. Well, first I want to give a big shout out again for Adi, who's made all of this possible in this program. Now, so I want to just take 4 or 5 minutes at the outset just to kind of frame the discussion and sort of get some pains out on the table that we might want to follow up on. So David, I am a philosopher by disciplinary training. I often say I'm undisciplined by temperament, however. And I always say, if you want the straight story about anything, you should ask a philosopher. And that's because whoever gets the money as a result, it won't be the philosopher. So they're the only one who can sort of, you can count on to sort of tell it how it is. So I'm going to begin by just by saying some things that I think are true, that help to frame the discussion. And they might sound depressing, but I think, we're adults, even the youth among us, and we need to look our situation in the eye. So first of all, we live in a world that's characterized by extreme and radical inequality, both across nations, but even more predominantly and increasingly within nations. So everything we do in this world, every action that we try to take to make the world better is conditioned by that inequality. Secondly, we live in a world which is extremely unstable politically, and we face a number of high-risk challenges. So we've talked a little bit about climate change, for example, but really in the background is an even larger risk, and that's the risk of nuclear war. Even a small nuclear exchange between two countries would be radically more disruptive of global climate than the disruption that we're likely to see without the small nuclear exchange. Now, millions of people, hundreds of millions of people have been victims of this radical inequality, of this political instability. But more than anything, animals have been victims of these human conflicts and human arrangements and human alterations of the environment of which they haven't had a part. And when we talk about conservation, I think we don't really know what we're talking about. That's kind of a name for a whole cluster of issues and problems that we can come back to. But we're sort of gesturing at the rest of the living world, what I like to call the more than human world, which in a sense is moving towards the sixth extinction because of what humanity is doing to each other. Now, against that background, we reach for technology, especially maybe in the United States, technology is, to use a kind of football metaphor, is always the Hail Mary pass. Right? When we don't know what else to do, we want technology to save us. We'll invoke technology. And in fact, technology can be super important. So in my department, for example, one of my colleagues, Jennifer Jacquet, has developed a piece of software called WildEye, which is a worm that goes out into the internet and identifies sites that are selling CITES banned animal parts. And it's being used by various law enforcement agencies around the world. And on the so-called supply side, we can talk about drones, for example. We can talk about all kinds of things that are being used to try to help bring poaching under control. But it is important, I think, to recognize that at its best, technology is a means. There's nothing about technology that makes it intrinsically good. It's another tool that can be used for various purposes. And in fact, the kind of radical inequality that I'm talking about is in part driven by technological development and who has captured the benefits of that technological development. And for that matter, even when it comes to animals, technology can be used in their interests or against their interests. For example, there's been work that's been done in Australia, where there's been, particularly in the West Coast, where sharks have been tagged. You know, these days to be an animal is to be tagged. If you're not tagged, you don't really exist in the animal world, right? But what's happened is that tagging and monitoring system has actually been used to kill sharks that have been seen as threats to humans. So rather than educate the humans to stay away from the sharks, it's easier just to kill the sharks. So here's a case where a technology that looks like it helps us understand the behavior and know them better can actually be used against the interests of the animals. Now, I just want to end by just putting two other issues on the table. I mean, again, technology is a tool, but what I think is really driving this conservation crisis is really two things. One thing has to do with the unintended consequences of our actions due to long and quite obscure supply chains. So when I go to my little cell phone shop on Broadway, for example, and buy a cell phone, I don't mean to be disrupting a mining community in some part of the world. I don't mean to be setting in motion a chain of events that will create a new road in what was otherwise a protected area, that will disrupt the local economy in various ways and reward new certain lifestyles as opposed to traditional livelihoods and all of that. But everything we do by way of consumption has these unintended consequences. So in that sense, the logic of the, I think it's better to call it the extinction problem really than the conservation problem, is really the same as the logic of the climate change problem. Nobody intends to change the climate. It's just the consequences of all of these actions that we do in trying to live a certain kind of good life, which involves high consumption. The second issue that I really do want to put on the table is the conservation issue, the extinction problem, is also a problem of values. How much really do we value the animals with which we share the planet? When we say, for example, that wildlife must pay its way, or that the way to protect animals is by auctioning off some of them for trophy hunting purposes and so on and so forth. I mean, that's a statement about the kind of value that we place on those animals. And we can argue whether that's right or whether that's wrong or whatever. But to a great extent, the challenge we face poses the question squarely in our eyes, do we think that we humans are the superior species that has a right to dominate the planet and other forms of life should only exist at our pleasure? Or do we think that in fact there should be something that looks a little more like species egalitarianism along with human egalitarianism?
To Dale's point about technologies possibly exacerbating inequalities and leading to perverse outcomes like using tags to identify dangerous predators or animals that will harm humans. I was thinking earlier about how the democratization of technology that has been made possible by the affordability of mobile phones, for example, has put tremendous computing power into the hands of ordinary Africans and others around the world, including many, many farmers and others living in Africa. And how that technology could be used for good, both in the cause of improving the livelihoods of those people, as it already is, through M-Pesa and other, mobile banking platforms, but also through the possibility to look at how you could actually use mobile payments to provide monetary incentive. And I'm an economist, and I know money isn't everything, but it does actually make an important difference if you can convince people that this would actually help pay for food for their families or clothes or books for their children, whatever. If you could actually think about using that technology and things like crowdfunding platforms to let people who care about the environment in the developed world to the people who can actually make a difference on the ground in the developing world through direct transfers of payments for services provided in one way or another to protect species, to protect habitat for species, to work for some of the things that we're trying to achieve through a forum like this. So that's a question, and I'd like to hear Dale's reply to that, but also hear what you have to say. Maybe some of you are technologists, and maybe you're already doing this. I don't know. So that's one. The second, well, let's start with that. Okay, I don't want to be late.
Okay, I'll just be quick and say one thing. I agree that technology has enormous potential for good, and what happens when we develop technology, we're sort of imagine the internet. Information wants to be free. We sort of imagine the liberatory and emancipatory power of these things. The problem is that again, this isn't a criticism, it's meant to just be analytic. In the kind of economic system in which we live, technologies are not developed for altruistic purposes to make the world a better place. Technologies are developed for people to make profits. And what that means is that those technologies then essentially get implemented in a way that reproduces the existing power relations. And so potentially emancipatory technologies like the internet, like social media and so on, we become disappointed in the way that they're used when we discover that they're being used essentially to promote private interests. But we shouldn't be surprised. That's just simply part of the game, given the economic and political organization of the world.
Okay, I'll push back on that a bit. Yes, when I'm a mobile phone user, Intesa user in Kenya, let's say, or Tanzania, or whatever, I'm sure that my data is being mined by some private company for profit. I have little reason not to think that. However, the company that provides that service, the mobile banking service, they do it because they get a profit from providing me with a valuable service, which I'm using to better myself. So I don't really see that as a problem. I guess it's a question of, and I think the biggest challenge in this space is really the one you raised earlier about how much we value other species in their own right, as opposed to, only insofar as they have utility value for us. And so far, everything we've heard today, and I think everything we see in the world suggests that it's hard to make the case to most people that if it comes down to a choice between who lives, this animal or myself, then I'll be neutral in that in that decision. So I guess what is it that would, I won't say ever tip the balance, because we do live in a world where human beings do dominate other animals by virtue of our intelligence and our ability to use technology to dominate the planet. Whether that's good or bad, that's the reality. We live in the Anthropocene, and so that's the starting point. The question is, what do we do to mitigate our impacts on the natural negative impacts and to maximize any positive impacts we may be having, and how to move from one to the other. And so I would suggest, even though this may not be entirely attractive to all, that placing a monetary value of some sort on for example, forests, like we were talking about earlier with Red Plus. Supposing that you could actually get someone to pay for keeping that forest intact, what the opportunity cost is. And the big problem is that we don't find a way that anybody's willing to pay the farmer in Kenya or in Brazil, what the true opportunity cost is of keeping that forest standing. And so that is the big challenge, it seems to me, because that benefit of keeping the forest standing is a global benefit. It's shared by literally billions of people around the world. And the cost is borne by one farmer who's decided not to clear cut his farm. How do you make, bridge that gap between those enjoying the benefits and the one bearing the cost? And we haven't found a way to to do that yet, and I don't know that we can, but I think that's got to happen if we're ever going to get to grips with this problem.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just say this and then we'll go to the audience. I don't really disagree with anything you said, David, and I think that there are a lot of pragmatic choices we have to make at particular times. I mean, we run very quickly to these forced choice situations, me or the animal. Well, what about me and my next door neighbor? I know who I'm going to choose if it comes to that. Most of life is about avoiding forced choices, right? Rather than sort of obsessing about what we do when we're in them. But I just want to, just as the last thing, just really pull us back. There's a ton of great people and great organizations doing great work. But the fact is, the natural world is in collapse. That we're in the sixth extinction. Despite all of this great work, we know where this is headed in 50 years. Red plus or not red plus. We know that we're on a trajectory of massive loss in the natural world. And I think in some way we need to go back to basics, and we need to think about this much more on a sort of century timeline than on a 5-year, 10-year, or 20-year timeline. And I think that that this will require a fundamental rethinking of our values and what's important to us. And we may decide that, in fact, okay, we're going to live in this human-dominated world, and we're going to make the best of it. But then that's a choice that we need to own. Instead of sort of pretending that somehow we can, quote, save the natural world through a fairly motley collection, if you'll excuse the term, of very well-meaning NGOs, funded by good people all over the world, an extremely weak international system, and then a system of national governments that are more or less effective, but always guided by their own national self-interests. That system is just not a system that's going to protect wild nature.
I just want to say one thing for you, David. You were talking about technology. Oh, no, I got myself. You were talking about technology not being a negative thing when somebody is using your data, and then you mentioned nature and how humans or how animals are actually becoming extinct. And when I was listening to her, I actually came to a realization that what was missing for both of them, if you strip the context and you strip the labels of whether it's technology or animals, what's missing in both of them is respect. Mm-hmm. And the piece of respect that we have to someone's privacy is what's missing in technology. It's not the use of the information. Because I can choose to give it, it's not a problem. I hit consent and it's fine. But if I don't know that it's used, that's where the problem lies. And with animals too, coming and thinking that we can do certain things, or with other cultures, right? We don't come with respect. And I think that is going to what you said, Dale, about values. I have to go back to my experience in Bali. What I have learned over there is the concept of permission. Not like we think about it in the West. Can I take that? And I'll bring it back to you. But the concept of permission from a place of, when I enter your land, I ask permission to come into your land, right? Even if it's internal. And when I want to tell you a story, or I want you to do something for me, it's not because there is an exchange of money that I'm entitled, right, to take it and do whatever I want with that. There is that concept, that value of permission does not, I find, does not exist in the West. I have a question for you, Dale. One of the things that I'm also, besides being a jewelry designer and an accidental activist, I'm also a student for the Glasgow University College here in New York for impact investing and sustainability in business. And that had really opened my mind to the catastrophes that are in the world, because I was kind of in a bubble of La La Land, thinking that it's easy to make the world a better place with a tagua seed. And what really, really came to my realization is that even the UN doesn't get it right. The UN's 3 pillars for sustainability is people, planet, and profit. How can you shift values that human life and environmental existence and working within an international community is more important when you have profit as the 3rd pillar. So my question to you is, if you get to choose what to replace it with, what would that be?
You know, we can write the equations for how to make profit work with preserving a whole lot of values that we have. We can talk about externalities. We can recommend various kinds of policies for internalizing those externalities. And I mean, it's not hard to do on paper. What's hard to do is to do it in practice. But I think, you know, I mean, this is almost kind of a critique of all academic disciplines, if you will. At some point, we have to recognize that it's great in theory, just not in practice, so the real world had better just conform to theory. We're going to have to give up on that, and we're going to have to take the reality of how a profit-motivated system actually works in the real world, and not just focus on how it could work given the nice theories of neoclassical economics. And that requires, I think, a really different way of thinking about things. I mean, including, for example, paying a lot more attention to indigenous knowledge and the different forms of knowledge, you know, that are subordinated around the world and all of that. I mean, just the last thing on this. One of the things I have to say as an American that I get really, really sick of is, you know, we get this now because we have a government that a lot of us don't like, and so on. We're like, oh my God, you know, this is terrible. America's losing its leadership in the world. You know, we really need to do this so we can lead the world here. No, I'm sorry. The first principle of ethics in this world ought to be do no harm. The world does not need the rich, over-consuming people of the world to lead it into a golden age. What the world needs from the rich, over-consuming people is to cut it out, right? I mean, the problem really begins at home. It's not about improving the welfare of other people. It's about restraining these incredible causal forces that we put in motion that is creating so much of the destruction beyond the shores of this country.
Human trying to oppress human and trying to oppress animal, and it comes to a question of value. So what are our value? It may seem utopic, but I think it's very essential, because when Francis Schaeffer said, how should we then live? It's like, if we want to live in this society and having the way of building something, a circle where everybody can kind of benefit from the growing of the system, we should have more strong ethical value, because all the problem come from the leaders or whoever has the power and thinks it can oppress either a human or either an animal, and it comes to the same thing. So is there even possible to kind of put the value at the center of our discussion? Because that's where it starts.
Well, I mean, this is more a philosopher's question, but I'd like to just reinforce what you were saying, because as I told you the other night, Dale, I've been reading up a bit on environmental ethics for my daughter's school, and this question is posed. Where does human empathy for or moral concern for other species stop? Given that species range from primates to the coronavirus.
Yes.
So, what is the ethical dividing line, if you will, or is there one? How do you determine, where it is that we should actually, hold ourselves morally responsible for the welfare of other species, and where is it clearly the case that we should not, or there's no need, there's no moral basis? So I'd like to sort of...
So I'm not going to answer that question, but I do. But I do want to pull something out that I think you said and really emphasize it, because I think it's hugely important. which is there's a link between humans dominating humans and humans dominating and subordinating animals. And you can even see it in the language that we use. That we use animal language for humans whom we want to dominate and subordinate. I mean, the animal is the paradigm of the thing that we feel entitled to dominate. And so when we dominate other people, we say, oh, they're like animals, they're like dogs, they're like this, and they're like that. So so sometimes people try to break apart this idea. Do you care about people or do you care about animals? Well, actually, in the structure of hierarchy and domination, it is the same. I mean, there's no difference between them.
If you examine the thought of these animals, some of them very intelligent. You look at China, they're breeding them for food. So it's not just the wild animals in the wild, it's animals in the world that need justice, as well as people. You have now in India, they're treating the fourth group there. They don't have papers, they don't have any type of authority, and soon they're not going to be a part or an Indian citizen if they can't prove who they are and where they were born. So I think it's people and animals we have to look at together. I agree with you thinking of an animal as a human being.
Amen.